Medieval castles are often thought of as places of constant siege and warfare. Well, that just wasn't the case. Most medieval castles, come on, get on. Most medieval castles were peaceful. For most of their lives, they were perhaps in a state of readiness, yes, but they were not under siege. Let's imagine a hypothetical small castle on the borders, on the marches, the edge of the kingdom, designed to protect the kingdom from invading barbarians or whatever you might want to call them, the other people over there that you don't like. What was it actually like on a daily basis? What happened and who did what? Let's begin our day at dawn. Why not? The sun is rising, there is warmth starting to come into the air, the night watch is over, and people are beginning to wake up. Now, night watches were typically modelled in the medieval period after the Roman principles, the vigili or vigili, hence the term vigil, typically divided into 3 or more, normally 4 shifts, starting at sunset and going all the way through dawn. Now, the medieval period did love the Romans a lot. There weren't that many documents left around as far as the medieval people were concerned, but there were quite a lot of fighting manuals and military manuals, and those were very sought after by the nobility for their wisdom and wisdom of the ancients, I guess you could say. They almost certainly mispronounced their Roman words though, so vigili is probably how it may have been pronounced by the Romans. I'm not an expert, but it might have been pronounced with a V sound, vigili, hence the vigil, shortened to the night vigil. Well, not quite medieval, the Eltham Ordinance in 1526 describes how the king's chambers should be secured, what security there should be, and it states that the yeoman should check the king's chambers 4 times a night for fire, disturbance and attack. Now it's interesting it's in that order, because I think for most of the medieval period, fire was actually the biggest threat. Everybody's got, well, not everybody's got candles. Most people have got candles burning. They've got rushlights, there are fires, everything's flammable. Fire was a very, very big feature in towns, cities, castles. I mean, even today it's a problem, but back then it was particularly difficult. Everything is made of flammable materials, apart from the stone, I suppose. And so keeping an eye out for fires and dealing with them quickly if they break out was very important. What's interesting to note is that some great structures, castles themselves, monasteries, that kind of thing, abbeys, often had the kitchens as a separate structure. That's very deliberate. It probably means your food's going to be a bit cold when it's carried out from the outside to where you're going to eat it. But the fireplace in the kitchen was the most likely place to catch fire, and so all that would happen is your kitchen would burn down and you'd build another one. It wouldn't burn the whole place down. So people were very, very aware of fire. I think they were less worried about attack, if I'm brutally honest, even on the marches. And I think the night watch was more about sort of keeping the peace as much as anything. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 actually codifies the number of night watches that should be done in every borough and city. And it talks about a watch should be kept every night in every city and borough, continually at night from sunsetting until sunrising. It's very specific. It also recommends 6 men at each gate, so I suppose it depends how many gates you have, but 6 men at each gate, and 15 men in the city, it says, which I presume is a free-ranging kind of patrol, if you like. Whether all 15 would be together at the same time, I don't know, whether they'd split up into sub-patrols or something, but that's quite a lot of people watching overnight. I perhaps assume that there'll be some rotation there, but 6 people allows, I suppose, 5 to guard the gate in the event of an attack, and 1 to run and raise the alarm and get help. Don't really know, but I was quite surprised when I realised how many people were supposed to be involved in night guarding, in the vigil at night. I haven't found a record of ordinary people attending daily mass, but I think it's quite possible that there was some kind of daily blessing. There would be a full-time priest, possibly several in a fortified stronghold like this, who would attend to the spiritual needs of the occupants. So it's not impossible that some people attended early mass, brief one perhaps. I also wonder whether it's possible that the garrison gets together a little bit, like a modern day stand-up might be, a brief meeting to discuss who's doing what the threats are, especially if there are rumours floating around of an attack on the horizon. Therefore, people just need to be a little bit more organised and a little bit more coordinated. So I think it's possible, although I've not found any evidence of that. Maybe people just knew what they had to do in the morning and go to their station and stay there. I like to think, though, there was a bit more of human interaction. The various castle people discussing what needed to be done and what the priorities for the day were. Of course, everybody else in the castle is going about their daily tasks. They probably aren't worried too much about maintaining the watch or the being military at all. They're getting on with the normal tasks because, as everybody knows that's worked in anything military, the actual fighting people are a minority. There are many, many more people in the background who are looking after things, cooking the food, digging the latrines, just moving things around, logistics, preparations, repairs, weapons, maintenance, all that kind of stuff. So typically, a medieval army was the same. It might have, in this case, 50 men in the garrison. There's probably at least 100, if not more, wives, children, attendants, servants, washerwomen, hangers-on in general. So whilst the garrison may be 50 people, the actual fortified place itself is going to be host to at least 200, I would have guessed. 3 to 1 is probably quite minimal. I think modern armies fight with much more kind of assistance than medieval, than might be 3 to 1. But that's a guess. 3 to 1 seems not unreasonable. It possibly varied hugely, and it varied by the seasons as well and what people are doing. Obviously, during harvest, people are going to be working very hard in the fields and focusing very much on that. In the winter, with the short days, there's not that much to do really. You've got to maintain things, you've got to make sure things don't get flooded and drained, don't get blocked with the mud. But broadly speaking, there isn't much to do, to be honest, and so you just want to concentrate on keeping warm and staying fed. The stronghold has men and women, of course, so you've got the wives and daughters of the occupants, the garrison, and the lord in residence, but you've also got the wives and daughters of all the other people doing specialist jobs like blacksmiths, which are typically done by men, not always, but typically done by men, maintainers of the horses, the ostlers, and people who looked after the organisation of the castle itself. One thing that might be notable to a modern audience actually seeing what's going on is that most women would be, even if they're sitting resting, they're not doing nothing. They're using the drop spindle. A drop spindle is a very simple spinning device, and it was quite symbolic of womanhood actually, and it's something that girls would have practiced and then continually done. And it's I've been told, I've never used one, but I've been told it's quite meditative, and what it's doing is it's spinning wool. It's spinning yarn, linen, flax and linen, or it might be spinning wool, and that is just constantly making thread. Thread was needed for all the garments that were going to be woven, and the only way to do it was by hand at this stage. So every woman, even if she's sitting chatting to her friends, is going to be sitting there probably using the drop spindle. Because it was a symbol of womanhood, I think it's very likely that many women were very proud of the type of thread that they could make. I haven't found too much reference to that, but I imagine there was a sort of hierarchy of quality, and that the sign of being a good woman was to be able to make very delicate thread, perhaps. I don't know, maybe they weren't that bothered by delicate threads, but the wools varied, perhaps much more so than today. You could get incredibly fine woolen fabric that feels not like silk, but in that direction. And so I think the recognition that a lot of that was done by hand. They would be very skilled people, and I think it would be meditative, a little bit like using a fidget spinner or something like that. So it helps people chill out really. And of course, people are going to be stressed out because remember there are rumours of an attack, so everybody's on edge a little bit, and they need something to calm them down. So drop spindles would have been visible pretty much everywhere, especially the high status ladies who have less physical work to do. Obviously, if you're washing or cooking, you can't use a drop spindle, but if you have a spare moment, you're sitting, chatting to somebody or discussing something, you can use a drop spindle as you sit there. Our castle has a hierarchy. There's the lord at the top, the lord and the lady, they're his household, but there are also the sub-bosses. The castellan is in charge of everything to do with the castle, everything to do with the military side of the castle. So the soldiers, the watch list, the rotations, the maintenance of arms and armour, the armoury itself, perhaps what kind of horses were trained, and the training of the fighting men. There was another person though, the seneschal. The seneschal was in charge of the non-military components of the castle. So the provisions and the repairs of the structure itself, and ordering things and getting cloth in, and all of the non-military components were controlled by the seneschal. And the seneschal also needed to do the accounts, because bookkeeping was very, very important. It had to be written down. Whether the actual seneschal themselves did it, or whether they dictated it to a scrivener, to a priest, or somebody who had the skills for writing, I think that's more likely. So it would be, technically the seneschal was in charge of that, but it might be handed down to a clerk to actually write the numbers down and fill in the details. And every export and import, every purchase, every sale, everything that came to the castle had to be written down and recorded, and everything that was used up had to be written and recorded. This is important because a lot of castles needed to have food put by. If you're going into a siege, you need to be able to provide food for the substantial number of inhabitants for potentially a substantial number of days, if not months sometimes. So maintaining food stocks was really, really important, a very, very important strategic job. The 14th century Black Book of the Admiralty specifically talks about the constable being in charge of the castle, and it says, "The constable shall have the keeping of the castle and the king's artillery, and of all the harness and things necessary for war." Harness is what would have, well, is best described as the armour, as the armour of the fighting men. So if I wear my 15th century plate armour, I'm wearing my 15th century harness. That would have been the term they would use in period to describe armour. And you might recognise it from a phrase that still exists today. There is, if you ever look at an insurance premium, if you ever look at insurance terms, you can be insured for what's called death in harness. Now, some people think this is to do with horses and things like that, but I don't think it is at all. What it means is you're insured if you die doing your job, or if you die while employed. And that comes from wearing armour. You die while wearing armour, metaphorically in the modern era, you die doing your job. So I think that's really interesting, tiny little echo of the military terms to have harness there. There's a 15th century book called the Book of Courtesy, and it actually talks about the steward or seneschal's duties, and it specifically says this. It says, "The steward is to take heed that the Lord's table be duly served, the cellar duly filled, and accounts of each department properly kept." Noble women sometimes took command. We know this from the Paston letters in particular, where noble women took charge of the castle in the Lord's absence, and did so very, very successfully. And in some cases, it's implied in the letters that in fact they're in charge of the steward, and they're perhaps in charge of the constable as well, and bossing things around. As you can imagine, different personalities would handle things differently. But noble women were expected to step up sometimes and take charge even of things like castles. Now, the people we've spoken about up to now are associated with the Lord's household, and usually associated with sort of higher status. They're not noble, obviously the Lord and Lady are. The other people are not, but they're sort of in this realm that isn't noble but is also not common in the same way. But the common leadership might be led by a bailiff. Bailiffs do what bailiffs do today. Bailiffs are in charge of gathering money and looking after things, but also the sheriff or the shire reeve, the reeve itself. The word sheriff comes from shire reeve. The reeve was the senior ordinary person, if you like, the senior peasant perhaps, or yeoman. They probably wouldn't think of themselves as a peasant, but they were ordinary people and they were in charge. So they were, I suppose, a little bit like the police in some way, although they wouldn't have thought of themselves as that. They were just in charge of organising things, and had a leadership role for the ordinary people in particular, possibly the non-military people in particular. The military people would answer to the constable,
The castle itself answered to the steward, but the bailiff and the shire reeve would really be in charge of all the non-military ordinary people and keep an eye on them and suggest what they should do and deal with complaints sometimes too. No castle can do without tradies, of course. These are the specialist, usually men, the specialist builders, constructors, makers of things. You would have carpenters, you would have your blacksmith's group that usually have assistants and helpers there. You'd also have ostlers, people to look after the horses, specifically to train them and to maintain them. You would have washerwomen as well, very important task needs to be done. Cooking was usually done by women and maid servants. So you had a lot of tradies who had specific jobs within the organisation. You also might have masons on hand to strengthen fortifications or to repair things or to even build new bits, because a castle is built and then the fashions change and the ways of war change, and you might need a better parapet around the castle. You might actually need your wooden walls changing for stone walls, which would have been a very dramatic cost, but would have been very much more secure, particularly against fire. Fashions for the fortifications gatehouse would also change. So somebody might say, we need an extension to the gatehouse, we need a portcullis, we need a bit more of a drawbridge. The old drawbridge isn't good enough. So there's constant need for innovation and updating, which is costing money, of course, and that money comes from taxes, and that money is then paid to the specialist tradies to help out. Because of the potential rumours of an attack, the castle tradies, the carpenters in particular, are busy building what are called hoardings or behoardings over the top of the castle. So you've got the castle wall and the parapets, but they're building what can only be described as very strong wooden sheds that overlap. They sit on top of the walls and they sort of sit there. They create an overhang that you can drop things down. And they also create protection from lofted arrows. Because remember, arrows just don't fly in a relatively straight line. They can be lofted, shot high in the air and fall down on the guardians on the wall itself. So you'd be very vulnerable. You'd be wearing a helmet, so chances are they wouldn't hurt. But you don't really want to get an arrow in the shoulder if you could possibly avoid it. So the carpenters themselves are busy building behoarding over the gatehouse. The gatehouse is the most vulnerable part. It's an entranceway, it's used, it's protected by gates and a portcullis, but if there's an attack, it's the obvious place to attack. So they're building that out of mostly oak, some ash, whatever wood is available. It's taking a long time though to actually put hoarding around a whole castle, even if it was fairly small, would take a lot of time and money. So it wasn't done all the time, but it did increase the protection of a castle quite dramatically and made the walls almost impossible to scale because you've got this overhang and you can hide behind the thick wooden boarding that was going to be put up too. Dinner was the midday meal, and this would be served to all of the residents. If you want to keep your soldiers happy, you need to feed them. Same with everybody else. Hungry folk get grumbly and disruptive. So food, even if it's not particularly tasty, decent quantities of basic food are really important. Food for ordinary people is likely to have been fairly vegetable based. So it might be oats, it might be turnips, it might be legumes, particular peas and field beans, in quite large quantities. If they're lucky, some meat, probably not as much as we might eat today, but definitely some meat if you could. And if you want your soldiers to fight effectively, they need to be fed reasonably well. So they would probably kind of get more meat than the average person would, just because it's part of their job really. The upper status people would eat better usually, although in this particular circumstance, people are trying to maintain cohesion in the stronghold. So everybody is on not exactly minimum rations, but everybody's being sensible with the food, and it's plain but warm and filling. Then people go about their afternoon jobs. The cook would have led a fairly sizable team. If you're feeding 300 people, you're going to be doing a lot of cooking, so you need a big team of people in there. That would range in age from the cook themselves in charge of everything, to all of the kitchen staff, and there's usually a hierarchy. There'd be sub cooks and not chefs as such. That's more of a modern French invention, but there would have been people that were learning their craft as a cook, and all the helpers and assistants, the people chopping the food up in the first place, the people cleaning, scullery maids, a whole bunch of different stages. Usually the lower status you were, typically you would be younger, all the way down to children. You would have children, once they reached about 5 years old, they were expected to work in some capacity, some sensible capacity. It might just simply be sitting next to the fire, turning the spit, keep an eye on the meat that's roasting so that it doesn't burn on one side and remain uncooked on the other. So turning the spit was a job that a young child could potentially do. Possibly in the winter that was quite a favoured job as well, because it'd be nice and warm, possibly too warm sometimes. Occasionally in the great castles they had dogs working spits as well. They'd be running in a wheel and it would be turning, but I think that was fairly rare and a little bit of a novelty. It's much more likely, to my mind, that you'd have a low status servant, a low status member of the household doing those relatively boring but kind of important that they're done often type of jobs.
The lord of the castle has decided he needs to go quickly scout the lay of the land. He doesn't want to alert anybody to the fact that he's actually going to look for the enemy, but he disguises it by going hawking. So he takes his old codger, the cadger, the old man who's been with him for a long time, who looks after his hawks and carries the frame called the cadge that the hawks sit on. And he takes a couple of foresters with him as well. They know the lie of the land really nicely, and they've got longbows, so they can alert him to what's going on and recognise elements of change in the landscape. And he takes a couple of men-at-arms as well, just to be on the safe side, and goes off hawking. He comes back a couple of hours later with a brace of hare, which is very welcome for the pot. So those are taken by the ostlers off to the kitchen, where they'll be skinned and gutted and used for the pot, and he goes to consult with his castellan about what he saw. He didn't see much, but he suspects, he says there's a feeling in the air, there's something pending, and he's not quite sure what it is. So preparations are now underway.
Now, the cook would have also been supplied by food by the pantler, who was looking after the pantry, which would be typically all the dry goods, like bread, really, and the buttery, which is looked after by the butler. And the buttery was mostly the wet goods, like the wines and the ales, and in some cases the milk and water and these kind of things. Where cheese fell, I'm not sure. I think cheese was part of the pantry. But broadly speaking, you had two people in charge of the food supplies, one in charge of the drier goods and one in charge of the wetter goods, for want of a better word, the fluids, the drinks as such, hence pantry and buttery. And if you are familiar with Oxford colleges, you will know that the buttery is often where they keep the wine collections, and still to this day is where you eat. So it's sort of, the word is still in use in modern English, but in a very specialist way. As the sun begins to set on the end of a busy day, the last few stragglers go through the open gate. There's a group of travellers that have come from quite far away. They set off knowing the journey was quite a long one. They set off at dawn of the day, and they've been travelling the whole time. They're in a group for security and safety, and also comradeship as well. There's a train of ponies carrying provisions. That's very, very welcome. There's a lot of grain there and a few bales of wool as well. And there's a ragged minstrel who's trying his luck. He needs a place to stay the night. He's hoping to earn a few coins. If he's lucky, he's got to go and speak to the Lord to ask permission to sing at the dinner. But it's fairly likely he would be welcome. The principles of hospitality are still strong on the borders. Now, the gates are starting to be shut. So they've shut the great gates, but they leave the wicket gate open for a moment because there might be a few more travellers coming in, and there's no particular emergency. They don't have to close the gates at dusk exactly, but they do post a guard. There are guards there keeping an eye on things, and that wicket gate, that little small inset gate in the great gates, will be fastened, in half an hour or so. The lord of this castle is a marcher lord, which means he has been granted special permission by the king to raise armies, wage war, raise taxes, declare markets, all sorts of things that were normally reserved for the crown itself. And the marcher lords could do that themselves. This is because they lived on the frontier. They were assumed to need to be able to do these things to secure the borders of the kingdom. In effect, they were mini kings in and of themselves. They obviously couldn't commit treason. They weren't actual kings. They were subject to that kind of law, but pretty much anything else they could do themselves, which meant they were very powerful and often quite feared. The sun has now set on the castle. It's in darkness, and most people have retired indoors to the rushlights and candles and the fireplace that was in the main hall. Supper is being served, usually served a little after sunset itself, and everybody is eating heartily on trestle tables set up for the special purpose of that. They're not eating particularly magnificently. It's not a feast. It's just catering to keep people alive. So it would be pottage again. So a lot of barley and oatmeal, a lot of pea as well, and legumes of various different sorts. The hare that the Lord caught on his journey out has been very welcomed. He's kept some of that for his high table, of course, but there's a little bit gone around just to put some meat into the actual pottage that's being served for everybody else. So they're all they all welcome it. There is ale and there is plenty of water from the castle well. The castle well's protected by a little housing over the top to stop anything falling into it. And it's very good water. It's filtered through the natural landscape and it's very, very drinkable. People keep it well away from the latrines. The meal draws to a close. The high table retires to the solar, which is the only private bit for the nobility. Usually up a set of stairs and above the main area of things. But the trestle tables are cleared away, put to one side, stacked ready for the morning, and people find corners to sit. The night watch grab a few handfuls of extra bread, possibly a fairly heavy rye bread that would have been very common at the time, not the posh white bread that was served at the high table, but the peasants' very filling, heavy, perhaps slightly moist rye bread, and grab that, put it in pouch for their first watch because they know they're going to be cold. A little bit of casual drinking begins. Cheers. A few people play dice. The Lord has set up a chess set and he is playing the seneschal at chess. It's something they do very regularly. They're talking about strategy and tactics. Neither of them are very good chess players, but they enjoy the escape from convention, if you like, from the sort of way they have to behave normally. They can focus very much on the game of chess. The minstrel approaches the high table and is very polite and asks if the Lord minds if he sings. And the Lord said, no, fair enough, go ahead, sing. Don't make it too jaunty though. And the minstrel is familiar enough with an audience. He reads the audience and he realizes that they want a lament. So he starts the few tunes on his lute and sings a well-known sad song. And everybody's quiet because, don't forget, there is this ever-present threat of combat on the horizon. Nobody knows when it's going to happen. It's not noisy. Everybody's subdued, talking quietly. The ladies are off in one corner discussing things. The pony man, the pony handler that came in, is discussing with the ostler various things that he saw in the previous town he went to. There's a little bit of news is travelling, a little bit of exchange of information. And as the quiet tones of the minstrel drift up, the first of the night watch take up their positions on the battlements, looking out. Now, it's unlikely there would be flaming torches or braziers on the walls themselves because those ruin your night vision and they mark out the castle in the darkness for everybody to see for miles around. So it's cold. So they've taken some extra bread rations and they've taken an extra cloak because they know it's going to be cold. There is a wind picking up and it's starting to rain. Everybody begins to settle down. People take places on the floors. They start sleeping, curled up, more or less where they can find space. Some people are sleeping on benches. Some people are sleeping on piles of straw that they've strategically placed. Everybody's just trying to stay sheltered and reasonably warm. There are dozens and dozens of people in the Great Hall, so it's not going to be freezing cold because all those bodies keep the place warm, but there is going to be general hubbub of people whispering, talking quietly. But as things normally work out this way, everybody realizes they all need to go to sleep, so everybody starts to drift off. Up on the parapets, the first shift of the night guard are drawing their cloaks closer together, listening to the ends of the sounds of the minstrel drifting across the night, and thinking they're looking forward to bed. The first shift isn't particularly difficult. It just means you have to stay up slightly longer. The second and third shifts are the least liked for the garrison, and they're the ones where people draw the short straw and get a chance to do the second and third. The second shift is annoying because people have half gone to sleep and then they have to wake up. Most people stay awake for it, but it means they get a very short night's sleep because they get woken up in the morning by general hubbub of things happening. So it's hard to sleep in a castle where everybody's this close. The least favourite, of course, is the third shift, not the fourth. The third shift is the least favourite because you really do have to stay up and you are getting very tired. That really goes from roughly midnight to 3 or 4 in the morning, and that's the hard shift. Now, the constable is very aware of this, and because he is nervous and he's a little worried about what the Lord has said about the feeling that the landscape is giving, he wanders the parapet at night, just checking people are still awake and paying attention. Everybody knows they're at risk, so chances are they'll stay awake, and they're professional guards, so they're not going to go to sleep very easily. They're very aware that if they're caught sleeping on guard duty, they will be flogged, and that is quite persuasive for many. The constable does his rounds, finds everything is okay, double checks the gate and it's secure, and then he decides finally to try to go to bed himself. He finds space in the main hall next to the fire because he's important. He has a space reserved for him, and he tries to get to sleep, but something's bothering him. He just can't quite do it. It's toward the end of the third watch that something happens. There's a noise from the distance. The guards notice this, and a horn is blown, and a rider comes galloping to the castle in the dark. He's taken a huge risk. Travelling at night is dangerous. Travelling fast at night is really asking for trouble. The roads are not flat. There could be roots anywhere. The horse could stumble, but he has managed to get ahead of the news. And as he approaches the gates, one of the gates is opened and an alarm is rung. One of the guards is sent to ring the same bell that calls everybody to worship, to alert people that something's happened. This noise, everybody's half expecting it, and everybody wakes up, and even those that are heavy sleepers realise the sound has changed and something is happening. The constable is called first. The constable sends a guard to awaken the Lord, but the Lord is already awake because, again, he couldn't sleep very well, and something woke him early, and he goes to attend the gate and talk to the messenger. The constable says, "My lord, the messenger is talking about men approaching the castle." The lord says, "Let me hear it myself." And the messenger bows and says, "My lord, there are 100 raiders coming. They've just crossed the river. They are a few hours from here." The lord says, "Raise the drawbridge, lower the portcullis. Everybody take their positions." The alarm goes off and everybody makes for their allotted positions. What happens next?